Marea Hatziolos is a distinguished marine scientist and a leading voice on ocean conservation and coastal management. As a senior coastal and marine specialist at the World Bank, she has led initiatives to protect marine biodiversity and promote sustainable coastal development. Today, we are honored to have Marea Hatziolos with us to discuss the importance of ocean conservation and the impact of climate change on marine ecosystems. Thank you so much for joining the Swift Hour.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
I want to start with a broad, general question. Where are we big picture in terms of protection of marine ecosystems? Put it into a context of, say, the last 20 years of development of this. How are we doing?
We're doing better than we were, clearly. Probably 7% of the world's ocean is under some form of protection. That compares to about 30% on land. So we aren't quite there with respect to land-based protection. However, there is an initiative, a global initiative, to protect 30% of the world's ecosystems by 2030. And the marine environment, the ocean, is part of that initiative. So we have goals. Part of the Sustainable Development Goals include a goal for ocean health. And within that, and within the Biodiversity Convention, there is this commitment to achieve 30% conservation. And when I say conservation, that doesn't mean that it has to be excluded from all kinds of use. It means that there would be adequate protection to ensure what we would call a functioning of marine ecosystems, because the ocean is essential to life on planet Earth. It provides terrific goods and services that we rely on, not just for the air we breathe and the waste that we generate, but for food. Hundreds of millions of people rely on the ocean as their primary source of protein, and for jobs. World trade at about, and economic development at about $12 trillion a year. And in terms of climate change, the ocean is what has made it possible for the atmosphere to continue to function, in that the ocean absorbs about a third of the carbon dioxide that we as humans have generated, and 90% of the heat that has been the result of carbon emissions and global warming. So without the ocean as a buffer, without the ocean as a food source, without the ocean as our oxygen, we would be lost. So it's important to protect it. But we also know that people live next to the ocean in coastal areas. In fact, half the world's population lives along the coast. You can't exclude that development activity, human activity. So what you have to do is make sure that there are ways to manage people's interaction with the ocean and coasts effectively, so that the ocean can continue to provide these services and people can continue to thrive. So it's a partnership in a sense. It's a virtuous circle. The more you manage and conserve the ocean, the better it will be at providing these essential services that make it possible for economies to thrive and for people to be healthy and fulfilled.
I'd like to talk a little, dig into the idea of protected oceans. How do you protect areas where such a large percentage of it are deemed international waters?
It's a very good question. Most of the protection, as you suggest, is focused in areas near populations that can be monitored, where you can do effective management intervention. On the high seas, until very recently, we had no mechanism. Even the sea, the International Treaty for the Sea, did not regulate activity on the high seas. But recently, a high seas treaty, biodiversity protection of diversity on the high seas, was adopted. That took 20 years of work. Now we have the treaty, the High Seas Treaty on Biological Diversity, but we need to implement it. It needs to be ratified. That is where the rubber hits the road. So it will be difficult. However, countries have managed to do this, not so much on the high seas, but for instance, island nations in the Pacific have managed to get together, understanding that in order to survive and to protect their shared ocean resources, they need to come up with some effective management strategies. So you take the countries in the Western Pacific that have basically the best remaining schools of tuna in the world, and of course you've got all of these distant water fleets that want access to those tuna stocks. the country said, we have to get together and regulate this. So they developed a regime, which is like an auction, and they know how many tuna boats they can allow to fish in their shared waters, and this runs across the Pacific, that will still be sustainable. In other words, it would be a level that the tuna stocks can continue to replicate and replace themselves. So this is done through scientific analysis. And then they auction those days to fishing fleets. And there's a minimum price for 1 day of fishing. And then once those quotas are met, countries are allowed to come and fish. And they have a global observing system. Every fishing vessel must emit a signal that tracks where it is and where it's fishing. And that signal goes to a headquarters in the Solomon Islands. And they know exactly what's going on. And if there's a violation, these fishing fleets get fined. So there's a way to do it with surveillance and collective action and agreement among countries that they will act in their regional interest. It's difficult, it's a challenge, but it is possible. And we are developing the tools and the technology, particularly with remote sensing, drones, et cetera, and artificial intelligence will play a huge role in this, to be able to monitor activity on the high seas and ultimately protect it. Now, one of the main threats to high seas, apart from overfishing, which has been traditionally the worst threat, and let me say that 90% of the big fish in the world are gone. We have fished down the food chain so that we're only left with smaller fish. This has huge implications for how the ocean functions. But the point is that, yes, industrial fishing has had a huge impact on the ocean. And now the new frontier is mining, deep sea mining, to get these minerals and the kinds of essential and rare earth elements that are needed for batteries, for instance, lithium and other things. And these occur, in many cases, in deep sea areas adjacent to these small island states. So the question is, how do you convince these countries to protect these resources so they're not so much the actual marine nodules, but the destruction that happens as a result of the mining? How do you regulate that, but still allow countries to reap benefits from their ocean resources?
How do you balance the importance? Talk a little bit about coastal conservation. How significant is that in your portfolio?
Well, absolutely essential. I mentioned earlier that more than half of the world's population, particularly in the developing world, lives along the coast. And so we're talking about people like fishers who depend on coastal resources for their livelihoods. In some cases, these people are landless. And so the last resort for them to put food on the table to derive a livelihood is to go to sea. And so the temptation is to fish until the last fish is gone. And part of the problem has been an open access regime where it's sort of a tragedy of the commons. People don't have secure right to fish in a particular area. If they don't take the fish, somebody else will come from the outside and take it. So the whole question of use rights has been one, particularly in countries like Indonesia and the Philippines, these archipelagic nations which are spread out all over the place. How do you, at a local level, implement use rights? And so that has been working through community development, community engagement. And once communities have a defined boundary of their fishing area, they have an incentive to protect it because they can't fish outside of it. So they know they have to steward it and maintain those resources and allow them to replenish. And so part of that strategy is actually setting up what we would call a fully protected area. And it creates a bank of fish stocks that will, if they're not fished, will continue to reproduce, and eventually they will spill out into the area that is part of the fishing zone. So this is one of the tools that marine protected areas that are absolutely no-take are part of this larger management.
I feel like I'm talking to someone who works at a environmental NGO. Why is the World Bank so focused on this?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, most people would say, how in the heck did a marine ecologist end up at the World Bank, and what is your portfolio? And I said that I came at the right time and actually created a niche for oceans. Because at the time, of course, the bank was focused on agriculture, economic development, starting to get interested in education. But the ocean was very far from their focus. But I made the case, and colleagues of mine, that this was a question of demographics and geographic distribution. When you think of where coastal populations are located, I mean, where human populations in the developing world are located, it's along the coast, and some of the poorest of the poor are located there. And so the bank realized also that not only were we talking about very, very poor people, but trade, fisheries are important. Trade in fish stocks from Africa is the largest commodity that's traded to Europe and to other parts of the world because the other parts of the world have depleted their fish stocks. So it becomes an economic question, and managing those marine resources effectively is a contribution to GDP. Now, the other thing is that the bank did, and I helped start this sort of pathway, but I've been retired for many years now, was the notion of the blue economy as being the new growth frontier for many countries. Any country with a coast is concerned about generating more economic development and looking at its resources more holistically. So when you look at transport, when you look at tourism along coastal areas, that's a huge contribution to GDP and economic development. So the bank realized that it had an interest there, and in fact, the countries were demanding it. The countries understood that they needed to tap these resources more effectively. Sometimes they didn't have the capacity to do it, so they needed assistance to build that capacity, but also to manage it because they saw what had happened in forested areas, land use change, and they didn't want that to happen to the marine resources.
How do you balance, though? What do you say to people that say, well, wait a minute, our economy is now growing. We have these capacities for important economic growth. The rest of the world, other parts of the world have been able to take full advantage of theirs. We should have every right to take advantage of ours. So how do you balance the urgent necessity of conservation and ocean stewardship and coastal stewardship with the economic priorities of different countries?
Well, actually, sustainable economic growth depends on a healthy resource base.
Yeah.
And in many of these countries, the poorest countries, they are very, very closely tied to natural resources. You still have agricultural economies in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia, and fisheries resources are part of that. So you can equally well make the case if you don't take care of those resources, they will be depleted. You will mine them to the ground, mine them to the sea bottom, if you will, and they will cease to be generating the kinds of returns that you need to put your development path on a sustainable curve. So it's, people used to think it's either economic growth or conservation. No, they have to go hand in hand. And when they are functioning properly, you have a virtuous circle. Or as I said, the benefits are clear, they can be reinvested into good management so that you protect the goods and services of the ecosystem. Everybody benefits.
Well, we will leave it there. Marea Hatziolos, it is so wonderful to have you. Important to hear your perspective and also the urgent necessity of the issues you're covering at the World Bank. So thank you so much for joining the Swift Hour.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.